701 BCE, Spring. The second most important city in the Kingdom of Judah stood atop a fortified hill in the foothills southwest of Jerusalem, Lachish, a name that would soon become synonymous with terror. Its massive mud brick walls, 6 meters thick at their base, rose imposingly above a steep glacis slope supported by stone revetment. The city gate, one of the largest and most heavily fortified structures of its time, consisted of 3 pairs of chambers with wooden doors on hinges. To any defender standing on those walls, the city seemed impregnable. They were wrong. The Assyrian army was coming. And when King Sennacherib's forces arrived, they brought with them something that would transform fortified walls from symbols of safety into death traps, siege towers, massive wooden structures on wheels that turned vertical stone barriers into killing fields. But to understand how the Assyrians revolutionized siege warfare and made walls obsolete, we need to go back 180 years earlier, to a king who would pioneer the tactics that would terrorize the ancient world. April, 883 BCE. A new king ascended to the throne of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. His name was Ashur-nasirpal II. 25 years of conquest awaited him, 25 years that would redefine what it meant to lay siege to a city. The reliefs from his palace at Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, tell a story of innovation and brutality that changed warfare forever. Ashur-nasirpal inherited more than just a throne. His father, Tukulti-Ninurta II, had spent his reign campaigning throughout the region, consolidating territory, and building the resources that would fund his son's ambitions. But Ashur-nasirpal had vision. Where previous conquerors had struggled to breach fortified cities, often resorting to starvation sieges that could last months or years, he saw an engineering solution. The siege tower, not the first siege tower in history. Egypt had used them centuries before, and they appeared in Bronze Age Anatolia. But the Assyrian version under Ashur-nasirpal was different. It was systematic, professional, deadly. The Assyrians weren't raiders. They were the world's first professional standing army, permanent, well-equipped. And crucially, they had something no previous military force possessed, a permanent corps of engineers. These weren't soldiers who dug trenches when needed. These were specialists, men who understood mathematics, construction, and the physics of destruction. When an Assyrian army appeared before a fortified city, the engineers didn't improvise. They executed a plan refined through decades of siege after siege. The reliefs from Ashur-nasirpal's palace show us exactly what that plan looked like. First, reconnaissance. Engineers would circle the fortifications, studying the walls, identifying weaknesses. Gates were obvious targets, being the most vulnerable points in any defensive system, but the engineers looked for more. They analysed the terrain, the approach angles, the thickness of walls at different points. They calculated. Then they built earthen ramps, massive constructions of packed earth and stone that would rise from ground level to the top of enemy walls. These weren't simple piles of dirt. They were engineering marvels. The Assyrian engineers knew to the shovelful how much earth was required. They understood soil compaction, drainage, structural integrity. A typical siege ramp required thousands of tons of material. At Lachish, archaeologists have calculated that the Assyrian ramp needed nearly 20,000 tons of stones. Small boulders, each about 6.5 kilograms. That's roughly 3 million individual stones. Where did they come from? The engineers established quarries as close as possible to the far end of the ramp. Collecting field stones from surrounding areas would take too long. Instead, they quarried systematically, creating a supply chain that fed the ramp's construction day and night. Even working around the clock, building the Lachish ramp took between 20 and 25 days. But while the ramp rose, the real terror approached. The siege towers. These weren't the crude structures of earlier civilizations. Assyrian siege towers were purpose-built mobile fortresses. Rectangular wooden frames, often 15 feet long and 10 feet high. 4 wheels, sometimes 6 for the heaviest models, each wheel carefully constructed to handle the enormous weight. Inside the tower, a suspended battering ram. And this is where Assyrian innovation truly changed everything. The Assyrians were the first empire in Mesopotamia to master iron metallurgy on an industrial scale. While other armies used bronze or even stone for their battering ram heads, the Assyrians capped theirs with iron. Iron-headed battering rams, harder than bronze, capable of chipping away at stone or mud brick with devastating efficiency. The ram itself was a massive timber trunk, sometimes 20 feet long, suspended from chains or ropes within the tower. Metal chains, not rope. An iron chain was actually discovered at the top of the siege ramp at Lachish, confirming what the reliefs depicted. Ropes would wear out too quickly under the constant stress and friction. Metal chains could withstand weeks of continuous use. The ram's head wasn't just functional, it was psychological, often forged to resemble a ram's head, complete with horns, a battering ram. The symbolism was deliberate. This machine would batter down anything in its path. But the tower was more than just housing for the ram. The upper levels contained archers. Protected by wooden walls covered in fresh, wet animal hides, these archers had a crucial mission: suppression fire. When the tower approached enemy walls, defenders would rain down arrows, stones, torches, anything to stop it. The Assyrian archers would target anyone who appeared on the battlements. They created zones of death, areas where defenders couldn't show themselves without being shot. And there was more. On top of the tower, the Assyrians mounted something revolutionary: hoses. Leather hoses that poured water continuously over the wooden structure. Fire was the greatest threat to these siege engines. Defenders would throw torches, burning oil, anything combustible to set the towers ablaze. The water system countered this. If flames did catch, soldiers inside the tower had large ladles to douse the fire immediately. The reliefs from Ashurnasirpal's palace, now displayed in the British Museum, show these towers in meticulous detail. We can see the wheels, the protective coverings, the ram suspended inside, the archers at multiple levels, even the water systems. But they show something else, something that explains why cities surrendered at the mere sight of these machines. The aftermath, bodies, piles of them, impaled prisoners, flayed captives, decapitated enemies. The Assyrians didn't just conquer cities, they made examples of them. Ashurnasirpal's own inscriptions describe his campaigns with brutal frankness. He boasted about atrocities, public flaying, mass executions, deportation of entire populations. This wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was calculated psychological warfare. When word spread of what happened to cities that resisted, other cities surrendered without a fight. But let's be clear about the engineering genius here. The Assyrians didn't win through terror alone. They won because their siege technology made resistance futile. Consider the mechanics. A fortified city in the 9th century BCE had certain defensive advantages. Height. The walls rose 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet above ground level. Defenders fighting from above had gravity on their side. Arrows fired downward travelled faster and farther. Stones dropped from battlements gained lethal momentum. Attackers using simple scaling ladders faced nearly impossible odds. You'd be climbing a vertical surface while defenders above dropped rocks on your head, poured boiling oil, shot arrows at point-blank range. Most men wouldn't even reach the top. Those who did arrived exhausted, facing fresh defenders on their home ground. The siege tower changed this equation completely. First, it eliminated the height advantage. The tower rose to match or exceed the wall height. Suddenly, attackers and defenders met on the same level. Second, it provided protection. The soldiers inside weren't exposed to enemy fire during their approach. They advanced behind wooden walls covered in wet hide. Third, it delivered overwhelming force to a single point. Instead of scattered attackers on multiple ladders, the siege tower could deliver dozens of soldiers simultaneously to one section of wall. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the battering ram solved the fundamental problem of ancient fortifications. Walls were built to resist scaling and to absorb the impact of thrown projectiles. But they were weak in tension. Stone and brick are strong in compression. They can support enormous weight from above, but they're vulnerable to concentrated, repeated impacts. A battering ram exploits this weakness. Each blow creates micro-cracks in the masonry. With repeated blows, these cracks propagate and grow. Eventually, stones begin to shift. Mortar crumbles, and then catastrophic failure. A hole opens in the wall. The Assyrian infantry, waiting behind the siege tower, would pour through this breach. Heavy spearmen armed with double-bladed spears and straight swords, protected by iron mailcoats and conical helmets. Under covering fire from archers and slingers, they would storm into the city. But the siege tower wasn't the only weapon in the Assyrian arsenal. While the towers and rams worked on the walls, sappers were tunneling underneath. These specialized troops, heavily armored, would dig under the foundations. They'd create a cavity, shore it up with wooden supports, then fill it with combustible materials and set it on fire. When the supports burned through, the wall above would collapse. The defenders faced attacks from 3 directions simultaneously, the ram battering the wall, the tower delivering troops to the top of the wall, the sappers undermining the foundations below. It was coordinated combined arms warfare on a scale never seen before, and the psychological impact was devastating. Imagine you're a defender on those walls. You've spent your whole life believing these fortifications make you safe, generations of your ancestors sheltered behind these stones, and now you watch these massive wooden towers approaching. You hear the rhythmic pounding of the battering rams. You feel the walls shake with each impact. You see the cracks forming. Your archers shoot at the towers, but the arrows bounce off the wet hides or lodge harmlessly in wood. You try to set the towers on fire, but water pours down the sides, dousing the flames. Your commanders send men out to try to hook the battering ram with chains and pull it aside, but Assyrian soldiers with iron grapples counter the chains. You realize with growing horror that nothing you do matters. The walls that were supposed to protect you are becoming your tomb. This is the psychological transformation that the siege tower created. Walls went from being protective barriers to death traps. Once the Assyrians breached the defences, there was nowhere to run. The city was surrounded, escape was impossible, and everyone inside knew what came next. The Assyrians made sure everyone knew. This brings us back to 701 BCE and Lachish. By this time, Assyrian siege warfare had been refined through nearly 2 centuries of continuous campaign. King Sennacherib, ruling from his magnificent palace at Nineveh, faced a rebellion. King Hezekiah of Judah had stopped paying tribute. Worse, he'd allied with Egypt and encouraged other cities to resist Assyrian dominance. This couldn't stand. In the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib marched west with his army. He conquered the Kingdom of Israel. Then he turned south toward Judah. 46 fortified cities fell to his advance, and then he came to Lachish. Lachish wasn't just any city. It was the second most important settlement in Judah after Jerusalem. Heavily fortified with a double line of massive mud brick walls on stone foundations. The main city wall on top of the mound was 6 meters wide. A sloping glacis supported by a revetment wall ran along the middle of the slope. The city gate in the southwestern wall was enormous, protected by an outer gate in a massive tower built of large stones that protruded from the defensive line. The gatehouse on top of the mound consisted of 3 pairs of chambers with wooden doors on hinges. It was a fortress designed to withstand any siege. Sennacherib arrived and established his base camp north of the city. We know this from the reliefs he commissioned for his palace, an entire room dedicated to this single siege. 12 meters wide, 5 meters long, completely covered with carved panels, depicting every stage of the battle. The Lachish reliefs, some of the most important artifacts of ancient warfare we possess. They're now in the British Museum, preserved for nearly 3,000 years, showing us exactly what happened when Assyrian siege towers met Judean defences. The Assyrian engineers studied Lachish's fortifications and chose their attack point, the southwestern wall near the main gate. The terrain here was steep, requiring a massive ramp. But the engineers had done this hundreds of times. They established a quarry nearby and began moving stones. 3 million stones, 6.5 kilograms each. An army of workers, likely including captured prisoners and conscripted locals, moved these stones day and night. The ramp rose, 260 feet long, climbing the steep slope to reach the walls. The workers at the front of construction faced constant danger. The defenders on the walls above would shoot arrows, throw stones, anything to slow the construction. The Assyrians countered this with massive wicker shields, L-shaped structures tall enough to protect a man, thick enough to stop arrows. Behind these shields, the workers could move safely, even under fire. As the ramp approached the walls, the defenders' desperation grew. They could see what was coming. The siege towers. Multiple siege engines, each weighing up to 1 ton with the battering ram suspended inside. The reliefs show these machines in precise detail. We can see the rectangular wooden frames on wheels, the protective coverings of wood and hide, the ram suspended from chains inside, its iron head visible protruding from the front, and we can see something else, the operators, soldiers inside the towers working the ram. It wasn't just swung randomly, it was a precision weapon. The iron head was designed to chip away at mud brick, to exploit weaknesses in the masonry, to create focused damage on a single point. Other soldiers can be seen pouring water over the towers from above as defenders try to set them on fire. Archers in the upper levels of the towers are shown firing at the defenders on the walls, and we can see the defenders' perspective. Men crowded on the walls, shooting arrows down at the approaching towers, throwing torches. One relief shows a defender dropping a chain to try to catch the battering ram, but nothing works. The machines keep coming. The ramp construction reached completion. Wooden beams were laid on top of the stones, creating a smooth surface. This was crucial. The siege towers needed a level road to approach the walls. Any rough terrain would cause the wheels to stick or the tower to tip. The final surface was carefully smoothed and reinforced. Then the siege towers began their advance up the ramp. The sound must have been overwhelming. The grinding of wooden wheels on the wooden roadway, the rhythmic pounding of the rams against stone, the shouts of soldiers, the screams of defenders, the whistle of arrows, the crackle of flames. Inside Lachish, the defenders knew they were losing. The walls were cracking. The rams were relentless. The Assyrian infantry was massing below, ready to pour through any breach. Assyrian archers and slingers were keeping the walls clear of defenders. Sappers were probably tunneling as well, though the reliefs don't show this detail. The defenders made a choice. Some fought to the last. Others tried to flee. The reliefs show what happened next. The walls breached. Assyrian soldiers pouring into the city. Defenders being cut down. And then, the aftermath. One panel shows Sennacherib himself, seated on a magnificent throne, watching as prisoners are brought before him. The inscription above him reads, Sennacherib, the mighty king, king of the country of Assyria, sitting on the throne of judgment before the city of Lachish. I give permission for its slaughter. This wasn't just a military victory recorded for history. It was a message. This is what happens to cities that resist. Other panels show the consequences, Judean families being led away into captivity, men, women, children, walking in long lines, carrying what possessions they can, the city being plundered, chariots, thrones, weapons, all carried away, and more grimly the executions. The reliefs show prisoners being flayed alive, others impaled on stakes, some beheaded. These aren't hidden in cornerests, they're prominently displayed, meant to be seen, meant to terrorize. The siege of Lachish lasted weeks, possibly months when you include the ramp construction. But once the siege towers reached the walls, the outcome was inevitable. Archaeological excavations at Tel Lachish confirm everything the reliefs depict. The siege ramp is still there. 2,700 years later, you can still see it. A massive earthen structure rising up the southwestern slope. Excavations found the stones, the construction methods, everything matching the reliefs. They found arrowheads. Hundreds of them. Both iron Assyrian arrowheads and bone-tipped arrows made by the defenders when their iron supplies ran out. They found the iron chain at the top of the ramp, confirming that the battering rams were suspended with metal chains, not rope. They found evidence of the fire, the destruction, the slaughter, and they found something else, a counter-ramp. The defenders, recognizing that the Assyrian ramp was going to reach their walls, built their own ramp on the inside of the city wall, an attempt to raise their defensive position to maintain the height advantage. It didn't work. The Assyrian siege towers simply raised higher. After Lachish fell, Sennacherib moved on Jerusalem. But something strange happened. Jerusalem didn't fall. The biblical account attributes this to divine intervention. An angel struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded a different version. He wrote that a plague of mice overran the Assyrian camp, destroying bowstrings and equipment. The Assyrian records are more prosaic. Sennacherib claims he besieged Jerusalem and trapped King Hezekiah inside, like a bird in a cage, but he doesn't claim to have captured it. Instead, Hezekiah paid an enormous tribute, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, so much that Hezekiah had to strip the gold from the doors and doorposts of Solomon's temple. Why didn't Sennacherib press the siege? We don't know for certain. Perhaps disease did strike his army. Perhaps the tribute was sufficient. Perhaps the time and resources required to build another massive siege ramp weren't worth it when he'd already made his point at Lachish. But here's what we do know. The siege technology worked. Lachish, one of the most heavily fortified cities in the region, fell to Assyrian siege towers and battering rams. The walls that generations had built and maintained, that families had sheltered behind, that defenders had died protecting, became death traps. Once the siege towers reached them, once the battering rams began their work, the outcome was certain. This was the Assyrian innovation. Not just the siege tower, not just the battering ram, but the combination of professional engineering, systematic approach, combined arms coordination, and ruthless psychological warfare. Cities across the ancient Near East learned this lesson. When the Assyrian army approached with its siege train, resistance was futile. Surrender might mean harsh terms, tribute, hostages, but it meant survival. Resistance meant the siege towers, the battering rams, the breach, and then the slaughter. The reliefs from Ashurnasirpal's palace, from Sennacherib's palace, from multiple Assyrian kings, all showed the same message. We have perfected the art of siege warfare. Your walls cannot protect you. We will build ramps to reach them. We will bring towers to match their height. We will batter them with iron-headed rams until they crack, and when they fall, we will show no mercy. This is psychological warfare at its most effective. The Assyrians didn't need to actually siege every city. The reputation of their siege engines did half the work. Cities would surrender at the news that Assyrian engineers were establishing quarries and beginning ramp construction. Why endure weeks of siege when the outcome was predetermined? But the technology itself was remarkable. Consider the engineering challenges involved. The siege towers had to be tall enough to match enemy walls, sometimes 40 feet or more. They had to be mobile despite weighing tons. They had to be stable enough not to tip over on ramps. They had to protect dozens of men inside while approaching under fire. They had to house a 1-ton battering ram suspended on chains in a way that allowed it to swing freely. They had to be fire-resistant. They had to be constructible on site with available materials, because you couldn't transport a 40-foot wooden tower hundreds of miles across rough terrain. The Assyrian engineers solved all these problems. The tower frames were constructed from heavy timber, carefully jointed and reinforced. The wheels were massive, sometimes 6 per tower for the largest models, with multiple spokes like chariot wheels for strength. The protective covering was layers of wood. Then green hide stretched over the frame. The water system used leather hoses, probably made from entire animal skins, positioned to pour water over the most vulnerable points. The battering ram was suspended from multiple chains, allowing it to swing with tremendous force but remain controlled. The ram head was iron, shaped to concentrate force on a small point, often crafted to resemble an animal head for psychological impact. The tower had multiple levels, accessible by internal ladders, allowing archers to position themselves at different heights. The engineering specifications for these machines must have been refined through decades of trial and error. Which woods worked best for the frame, how to space the wheels for maximum stability, how thick the protective layers needed to be, what angle of ram swing delivered maximum impact, how to prevent the ram from swinging back and injuring the operators, how to ventilate the tower so the men inside didn't suffocate or overheat. All of this required systematic testing, documentation, and transmission of knowledge. This is what made the Assyrian military revolutionary. It wasn't just a collection of brave warriors, it was an institution. The permanent core of engineers maintained this knowledge. They trained new engineers, they refined techniques, they standardized construction methods. When an Assyrian army arrived at a fortified city, the engineers didn't need to invent solutions. They had blueprints, procedures, techniques proven through hundreds of sieges. They knew how many men were needed to move stones for a ramp. They knew how long it would take. They knew what materials they needed and where to source them. They knew how to organize the labor. This organizational capacity, this ability to systematically apply engineering solutions to military problems, gave the Assyrians an overwhelming advantage. Other armies had brave soldiers, other armies had good weapons, but no other army had this level of professional siege engineering. The legacy of Assyrian siege warfare extended far beyond the empire's borders. When the Assyrian Empire finally fell in 612 BCE, conquered by a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and others, the siege techniques didn't disappear. They were adopted and refined by subsequent empires. The Babylonians used similar methods when they conquered Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The Persians employed siege towers and battering rams. Alexander the Great's sieges of Tyre and Gaza utilized siege towers that owed their design to Assyrian innovations. The Romans, those master engineers of the ancient world, built on Assyrian foundations. Roman siege towers were larger, more sophisticated, but the basic principles were the same. Build a ramp, bring a tower, batter the walls, breach and storm. The siege of Masada in 73 CE used a ramp eerily similar to the one at Lachish, built 670 years earlier by Sennacherib's engineers. The transition from Assyrian siege warfare to later Roman and medieval techniques is a direct line. Each generation refined the technology, but the fundamental breakthrough happened in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, when Assyrian engineers transformed siege warfare from a waiting game into an engineering problem with a predictable solution. Let's return to the key insight. The siege tower transformed walls from protection into traps. Before the siege tower, walls worked because of the vertical dimension. Defenders on top, attackers below. Gravity favoured defence. The siege tower eliminated this advantage. It brought attackers to the same height as defenders. Suddenly, instead of shooting down at attackers struggling up ladders, defenders faced professional Assyrian soldiers on a stable platform, shooting at the same elevation. The psychological shift was profound. Throughout human history up to this point, building a wall meant safety. Walls kept enemies out. Families could shelter behind walls. Communities could survive attacks behind walls. The siege tower broke this fundamental assumption. Now the wall's location was fixed. It couldn't retreat, couldn't maneuver. The siege tower could approach at the attacker's chosen point. The defenders had to spread their forces along the entire wall perimeter, never knowing where the tower would strike. The attackers could mass their forces at a single point. Once the tower reached the wall, the defenders at that section were trapped. They couldn't retreat. If they left their positions, the attackers would pour through. But staying meant facing professional Assyrian infantry in close-quarters combat on a narrow wall top. And below them, the battering ram was methodically destroying the very structure they stood on. Imagine standing on a wall, fighting enemies at your own height, while feeling the entire structure shaking beneath you with each impact of the ram, hearing the cracks in the masonry, knowing that at any moment the section you're standing on might collapse. This is the transformation from protection to death trap. Walls became liabilities. Every defender committed to the walls was a defender who couldn't retreat, couldn't reposition, couldn't respond to changing circumstances. The Assyrian siege tower doctrine recognized this. Push the towers to the walls, keep them there, pin the defenders in place, let the rams do their work, and when the breach opens, storm through with overwhelming force before the defenders can reorganize. The tactics at Lachish demonstrate this perfectly. The Assyrian forces didn't spread around the entire city perimeter, they concentrated on the southwestern wall. One section, one massive ramp, multiple siege towers at that single point. Overwhelming force concentrated to create a breakthrough. The defenders had to match this concentration, pulling troops from other sections of the wall to the threatened point. This meant other sections were left lightly defended. If the Assyrians had wanted, they could have launched secondary attacks at these weakened points. The siege tower doctrine also incorporated deception and psychological warfare. The towers were terrifying to look at. Massive wooden structures, larger than anything most people had ever seen move, covered in dark hides, grinding slowly forward with mechanical inevitability. Inside, unseen soldiers operating the battering ram. Above, archers visible in the upper levels. Water cascading down the sides if defenders tried to set them on fire. The message was clear. We cannot be stopped. Your walls cannot protect you. Resistance is futile. Many cities surrendered when the siege towers appeared, not wanting to face what came after the walls fell. The Assyrian kings encouraged this. The reliefs in their palaces showed not just the siege machinery, but the aftermath. The executions, the deportations, the systematic brutality. This wasn't hidden. It was advertised. Look at what happens to those who resist. Look at what our siege towers can do. Look at what we do when we breach your walls. Save yourself. Surrender now. This combination of technological superiority and psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. The Neo-Assyrian Empire at its height controlled territory from Iran to Egypt, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Arabian desert. Not primarily through field battles, though the Assyrian army was formidable in open combat, but through siege warfare, through the systematic reduction of fortified cities, through the deployment of siege towers and battering rams that made walls obsolete. The economic impact was enormous. Building fortifications was expensive. Cities invested enormous resources in walls, towers, gates. Generations of labour and materials went into these defensive works. The Assyrian siege tower made much of this investment worthless. Walls that would have held off earlier attackers for months or years fell to Assyrian siege towers in weeks. This created a security dilemma for cities in the Assyrian sphere of influence. Investing in thicker walls, taller towers, these might slow an Assyrian siege but wouldn't stop it. The siege towers would simply be built larger. The ramps would be built higher. The resources spent on fortifications might be better spent on tribute to prevent the siege from happening. Many cities chose this option. Pay the Assyrians, acknowledge their supremacy, avoid the siege. This was probably the optimal strategy. From a purely rational perspective, the tribute demanded was harsh, but survivable. Resistance meant siege, which meant economic devastation even if you won, and total destruction if you lost. But humans aren't purely rational. Pride, independence, religious beliefs, all these factors led cities to resist despite the odds. And so the Assyrian siege train kept working. City after city, decade after decade, the engineers refined their craft. The siege towers became more sophisticated, the battering rams more effective, the ramps more quickly constructed. By Sennacherib's time, Assyrian siege warfare had reached its apex. The Lachish siege represents the culmination of 2 centuries of development. The reliefs show us the result. A perfectly executed siege. The ramp built with engineering precision. The siege towers deployed effectively. The walls breached. The city taken. The population killed or deported. The spoils carried away. And Sennacherib, sitting on his throne outside the conquered city, watching it all with satisfaction. He commissioned that entire room in his palace just for this single siege. Not his conquest of other kingdoms, not his battles against Egypt, just Lachish. Why? Because Lachish represented what Assyrian siege warfare could accomplish. A heavily fortified city, defended by determined soldiers, protected by massive walls, in terrain that made approach difficult, and the Assyrian army reduced it systematically. The siege tower doctrine worked. The technology worked. The training worked, the engineering worked, everything worked. Lachish fell, and every other fortified city in the region learned the lesson. Your walls cannot save you. The day the Assyrians brought siege towers, walls became death traps. This message echoed through the centuries. Long after the Assyrian Empire fell, long after Nineveh was destroyed and its palaces burned, long after the last Assyrian king died, the siege towers remained. Other armies copied the design. Other engineers refined the techniques. The basic principle endured. When you can bring a mobile tower to match the height of defensive walls, when you can concentrate force at a single point, when you can methodically destroy fortifications with iron-headed rams, walls stop being protection. They become obstacles that pin defenders in place while you destroy them. This is the legacy of Assyrian siege warfare. Not just the specific machines, though those were impressive, but the conceptual breakthrough. The recognition that fortifications are an engineering problem with an engineering solution. Build a ramp, bring a tower, breach the wall, storm through. Systematic, repeatable, unstoppable. The defenders at Lachish understood this too late. As they watched the Assyrian ramp rising day by day, as they felt their arrows bouncing off the siege towers, as they heard the battering rams beginning their work, as they felt the walls shaking beneath their feet, they understood. The walls that had protected generations of their ancestors, the walls they had maintained and strengthened and trusted, those walls had become their tomb. There was nowhere to run. The Assyrian army surrounded the city. The siege towers blocked retreat. The rams were opening breaches. Soon, Assyrian infantry would pour through. The walls that should have kept enemies out were keeping the defenders in. Death trap. This psychological reversal from safety to trap is perhaps the most profound impact of the Assyrian siege tower. It changed how people thought about fortifications. It changed the fundamental calculus of defense. Before Assyrian siege towers, building thicker walls, taller towers, stronger gates, these all increased security. After Assyrian siege towers, these investments had diminishing returns. Yes, thicker walls took longer to breach, but they would be breached. Better to invest in diplomacy, in alliances, in tribute, in anything that prevented the Assyrian siege train from arriving at your gates. because once those siege towers appeared on the horizon, once you heard that Assyrian engineers were establishing quarries and surveying your walls, your fate was sealed. The walls you trusted would become the trap you couldn't escape. This is the day the Assyrians used siege towers, and this is why walls became death traps. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Between Ashur-Nisirpal II in 883 BCE and Sennacherib's triumph at Lachish in 701 BCE, there were 182 years of refinement, of trial and error, of systematic improvement in siege technology. Each Assyrian king contributed to this evolution, and the stories of specific sieges, the human experiences of both attackers and defenders, reveal how this transformation unfolded in practice. Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 745 to 727 BCE, revolutionized the Assyrian military system. He created the first truly professional standing army, with regular pay, standardized equipment and permanent military infrastructure. Before him, Assyrian armies were partially feudal levies, farmers who fought when called. After him, they were career soldiers. This professionalization extended to the siege corps. Engineers became full-time professionals. They didn't farm in peacetime and build siege ramps when needed. They trained year-round. They maintained equipment. They studied previous sieges. They documented techniques. They became specialists in destruction. The siege of Damascus in 733 BCE demonstrated this new professionalism. Damascus, capital of Aram Damascus, was one of the great cities of the ancient Near East. Surrounded by formidable walls, protected by natural terrain, defended by a large garrison. Tiglath-Pileser besieged it for 2 years. Not because he couldn't breach the walls, the siege towers could have done that within months, but because he chose to starve the city instead. This reveals an important aspect of Assyrian siege doctrine. The siege tower was a tool, not an obligation. Assyrian commanders assessed each situation and chose the most efficient approach. At Damascus, the city was too large and too well supplied for a quick assault. The surrounding agricultural land was too rich to destroy easily. So Tiglath-Pileser blockaded the city, cut off supplies, and waited. The siege towers stood ready, visible from the walls, a constant reminder that resistance was futile. When the city finally surrendered, it did so knowing that the alternative was the towers, the rams, the breach, and then the slaughter. But at smaller cities that couldn't endure prolonged sieges, the Assyrian approach was swift and brutal. The siege of Samaria under Shalmaneser V and later Sargon II lasted 3 years, from 724 to 721 BCE. Samaria, capital of the Kingdom of Israel, held out longer than almost any other city against Assyrian siege. The defenders understood what awaited them. They'd seen what happened to other cities. They fought with desperation, but eventually the walls were breached. The biblical account describes the aftermath. The population was deported en masse. 27,290 people according to Assyrian records, though this number probably represents military-age males and their families. Thousands more likely perished in the siege and the sack. The Kingdom of Israel ceased to exist. The 10 northern tribes scattered. This was total war, Assyrian style. The systematic deportations were another aspect of Assyrian siege doctrine. Capturing a city wasn't the end goal. The goal was to eliminate resistance permanently. Deportation accomplished this. The conquered population was scattered across the empire, resettled in distant provinces where they had no connections, no support, no ability to rebel. Their land was then repopulated with people from other conquered territories. This policy, brutal but effective, ensured that conquered territories stayed conquered. No local population meant no local rebellion, and it reinforced the message: resist our siege towers and your entire people will disappear from history. Sargon II, who completed the siege of Samaria and ruled from 722 to 705 BCE, built a new capital at Dur-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad. The palace walls there were covered with reliefs depicting his military campaigns. One series shows the siege of a city, likely a Median or Eurasian fortress in the Zagros Mountains. The reliefs provide incredible technical detail about siege tower operation. We can see soldiers inside the tower working the battering ram. They're arranged in 2 teams. One team pulls the ram back using ropes. The other team releases it to swing forward. The ram head strikes the wall. The impact is absorbed by the chain suspension system. Then the cycle repeats. The soldiers are shown wearing armor, protected from any missiles that might penetrate the tower's exterior. The coordination required is evident. Pull, release, strike, pull, release, strike. Over and over, hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, each strike weakening the wall slightly, each impact propagating cracks through the masonry. Other soldiers in the tower are shown pouring water from the upper levels. The water cascades down the exterior, visible as wavy lines in the relief. Defenders on the city walls above are throwing torches. The flames are depicted reaching the tower but being extinguished by the water. The attention to detail in these reliefs tells us something important. These weren't idealized or propagandistic images, they were documentary records. The Assyrian kings wanted accurate depictions of their siege technology, because the technology itself was a source of pride. Look at what our engineers can build. Look at what our machines can do. Look at how we've solved the problem of fortifications. The siege towers weren't uniform. Archaeological evidence and artistic depictions show variation in design. Smaller towers for smaller cities, massive towers for major fortifications, towers with 4 wheels for level ground, towers with 6 wheels for rough terrain or steep ramps, towers with rams, towers without rams serving only as mobile archer platforms. The Assyrian military adapted its equipment to specific situations. This flexibility, this ability to customize solutions to particular problems, was another mark of their professional engineering corps. The economic scale of Assyrian siege operations was staggering. Consider the resources required for a major siege like Lachish. 3 million stones for the ramp, that's just the stones. Add the earth used to pack between the stones. Add the wooden beams laid on top. Add the siege towers themselves. Each tower required massive timber, not small branches. Full-size trees, straight and strong. These had to be sourced, transported, cut, shaped and assembled. The iron for the ram heads had to be forged. Iron in the 8th century BCE was expensive. It required specialized smiths, charcoal for fuel that repeated heating and hammering. Each ram head probably weighed hundreds of pounds of iron. Multiple towers meant multiple rams, multiple iron heads, the chains suspending the rams. These were hand-forged links, each one individually made and tested for strength. An Assyrian siege consumed industrial quantities of iron, the leather for the water systems, the hides covering the towers, the ropes, the tools for the workers building the ramps, the weapons for the soldiers, the arrows for the archers, the food to feed thousands of soldiers and workers for weeks or months, the water supply for an army besieging a city in the Near Eastern climate. All of this required logistics that were unprecedented in the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire didn't just conquer territory, it built the administrative and economic systems to support sustained military operations on this scale. The workers building the ramps and towers were themselves a mix of people. Professional Assyrian engineers supervised. Military personnel provided security and assisted with heavy labour. Conscripted local populations from recently conquered territories provided bulk labour. Prisoners from previous campaigns worked under guard. This mixed workforce had to be organised, fed, supervised and kept working efficiently. The Assyrian military bureaucracy handled this. They had staff officers who managed logistics. They had quartermasters who tracked supplies. They had engineers who supervised construction. This level of organisation was as important as the siege towers themselves. Back inside the besieged cities, the defenders' experience was one of mounting horror. The siege of a city by Assyrian forces followed a predictable pattern that defenders came to recognise. First came the scouts. Small groups of Assyrian cavalry or infantry would appear, observing the fortifications from a distance. Then the main army arrived, thousands of soldiers. The defenders would watch from the walls as the Assyrian camp was established, tents erected, supplies organised. Then the negotiations. Assyrian officials would approach under flag of truce demanding surrender. The terms were always harsh but survivable. Acknowledge Assyrian sovereignty, pay tribute, provide hostages, accept an Assyrian garrison, but avoid the siege. Most cities, especially smaller ones, surrendered at this point. Why endure a siege when the outcome was predetermined? The tribute demanded was heavy, but cheaper than the economic devastation of a siege. The hostages were usually nobles or royal family members who would be treated reasonably well in Assyrian captivity as long as their city remained loyal. An Assyrian garrison was humiliating, but not necessarily oppressive. It was rational to surrender, but some cities refused. Pride, loyalty to allies, religious convictions, hope that relief would come from other powers. Egyptian promises of support were particularly effective at encouraging resistance. Egypt, worried about Assyrian expansion toward its borders, would encourage Syrian and Judean cities to rebel, promising military support. This support rarely materialized or arrived too late. When surrender was refused, the Assyrians began siege operations with systematic efficiency. The city would be surrounded, camps established at key points around the perimeter. Any remaining civilians outside the walls would be captured or killed. Fields would be burned, orchards cut down, wells poisoned or filled. The economic infrastructure around the city would be systematically destroyed. This served two purposes. It prevented the city from receiving any supplies, and it sent a message: resistance will cost you everything. Then the engineering work began. The defenders could see it happening. Assyrian officers and engineers walking around the fortifications, just out of arrow range, pointing, discussing, making notes. Then the quarries would be established. The defenders could hear the work, stone being broken and moved, thousands of workers labouring day and night. The noise was constant. Psychological warfare through sound. Then the ramp would begin to rise, at first barely visible, then gradually, day by day, growing. The defenders could measure its progress against the landscape. Today it's as high as that tree. Tomorrow it's higher. The psychological impact was insidious. You could see your doom approaching at a predictable rate. You could calculate, if the ramp rises this much per day, and our walls are this high, then in X days the siege towers will reach us. Some defenders tried to build counter-ramps on the inside of the walls, raising their defensive position. The Assyrians would just build higher. Some tried to sally out and destroy the ramp. Assyrian soldiers guarding the worksite would slaughter them. The siege ramp was protected by infantry formations, by archers, by cavalry ready to respond to any sortie. As the ramp approached, the siege towers would appear. The defenders would watch them being assembled, the wooden frames erected, the protective coverings applied, the rams installed, the wheels attached, and then the towers would begin their approach up the ramp. The sound of wooden wheels on wood was distinctive, a grinding, creaking noise that carried. The towers moved slowly, deliberately, inexorably, soldiers inside invisible. But their presence was obvious from the coordinated movement. When the towers reached effective range, perhaps 100 yards from the walls, the Assyrian archers in the upper levels would begin suppression fire. Any defender who showed themselves on the battlements would be targeted immediately. This created zones of death on the walls, sections where defenders couldn't effectively fight back. The battering rams would begin their work while the towers were still approaching. The rhythmic pounding, every few seconds another strike, the sound would echo through the city. In the confined space of a walled city, sound carries strangely. The ram strikes would be audible throughout the entire settlement. Families huddling in their homes could hear it. Count the strikes, each one bringing doom closer. The defenders on the walls could feel it, the structure shaking with each impact. Small vibrations at first, then stronger. Dust and small fragments falling from the masonry with each strike. The cracks would appear, hairline at first, then wider. The defenders would try to reinforce the walls from inside, piling earth or stones against them, but this was futile. The ram was designed to penetrate deep into the wall, not just damage the surface. The Assyrian engineers knew exactly where to strike. Gates were obvious targets, but if the gates were too well defended, they'd target sections of wall between towers or buttresses, places where the wall was thinnest, or where previous damage had weakened the structure. As the cracks widened, the defenders' options narrowed. They could continue fighting, knowing death was approaching. They could try to surrender, though the Assyrians often refused once the siege towers were in action. The time for surrender had passed. Or they could try to flee, though with the city surrounded, this usually meant death. When the breach finally opened, it happened quickly. The wall wouldn't gradually crumble, it would suddenly fail. A section would collapse catastrophically. Thousands of pounds of stone and brick suddenly giving way. Anyone standing on that section would fall with it. The Assyrian infantry, massed behind the siege towers, would surge forward immediately. Heavy spearmen in iron armour. Professional killers with years of experience. They would pour through the breach in formation, shields locked, pushing into the city. The defenders, disorganized by the wall collapse, exhausted by the siege, often poorly trained militia would break almost immediately. Military resistance would collapse. Then came the sack. What happened next varied depending on the city's importance and the Assyrian king's mood. Some cities were treated relatively leniently. The fighting-age males might be executed or deported, the women and children enslaved or deported, the city stripped of valuables but left standing. Other cities faced total destruction, buildings burned, population slaughtered, the site sometimes abandoned completely. The Assyrian kings used these varying outcomes to calibrate terror. Cooperate and you'll survive, possibly even prosper as part of the empire. Resist mildly and face harsh but survivable punishment. Resist strongly and face annihilation. This spectrum of outcomes was deliberately maintained to provide incentives for surrender. The deportations deserve special attention. They weren't random cruelties, they were systematic policy. The Assyrian Empire maintained detailed records of deportations. Who was moved? From where? To where? The numbers involved were staggering. Over the course of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people were forcibly relocated. These deportees weren't killed. They were resettled, given land to farm in their new locations, expected to become productive subjects of the empire. But far from their homelands, cut off from their ancestral lands, their temples, their support networks, this policy was devastatingly effective at preventing rebellion. The psychological impact on surrounding cities was profound. When Lachish fell, Jerusalem was only 30 miles away, closer to 25 miles in a straight line. The refugees from Lachish would have reached Jerusalem within days. They would have brought eyewitness accounts, the siege towers, the battering rams, the breach, the slaughter, the deportations. King Hezekiah, standing on Jerusalem's walls, would have received these reports. He would have known exactly what was coming. This is why he paid the enormous tribute. 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. These weren't small amounts. A talent was about 75 pounds. 300 talents of silver meant over 11 tons of silver. 30 talents of gold meant over a ton of gold. Jerusalem's entire treasury, plus the gold stripped from the temple itself. But it was enough. Sennacherib accepted the tribute and withdrew. Jerusalem didn't face the siege towers. Its walls didn't become death traps. Hezekiah had learned the lesson that Lachish taught. The Assyrian siege towers couldn't be stopped. Better to pay than to fight. This cost-benefit analysis was exactly what Assyrian siege doctrine aimed to produce. The siege towers were so effective, so terrifying, that most cities would do anything to avoid facing them. This meant the Assyrians often won without fighting. The reputation of their siege technology was itself a weapon. The evolution of defensive architecture in response to Assyrian siege towers is fascinating. After experiencing or hearing about Assyrian sieges, cities began modifying their fortifications. Walls became thicker. Multiple defensive lines appeared. Towers projecting from walls allowed defenders to fire along the wall face at approaching siege engines. Gates became more complex, with multiple chambers and turns that would slow any assault. Glacis slopes were built steeper and covered with smooth stone to make ramp construction more difficult. But none of these modifications made cities immune to Assyrian siege technology. They just made sieges take longer. The fundamental problem remained. If the Assyrians were willing to invest the time and resources, they could breach any fortification. Some cities tried deception. False walls built in front of real walls, hoping the Assyrians would breach the false wall only to find another barrier. Assyrian engineers saw through this. Some cities tried to poison wells that Assyrian armies might use. Assyrian logistics were sophisticated enough to bring water from distant sources. Some cities tried scorched earth tactics, destroying everything around the city before the siege began. This denied the Assyrians local resources, but also made the siege more desperate for defenders who couldn't resupply. Every defensive innovation was eventually countered. The Assyrian military wasn't static. It learned, adapted, evolved. The training of Assyrian siege troops was systematic. New soldiers would be taught by veterans, the techniques of operating battering rams, the coordination required, the rhythm of the work, pull back, release, strike, do this hundreds of times without losing synchronization. The archers in the towers were trained specifically for suppression fire, not trying for individual kills necessarily, though those were welcome, but creating zones of death, keeping defenders' heads down, making it impossible for them to effectively resist. The water crews in the towers were trained in fire suppression, where to pour water most effectively, how to recognize when fire was actually threatening versus mere nuisance flames. The Assyrian army trained using mock-ups and exercises. We know this because ancient texts describe training facilities. Soldiers would practice assaulting walls using wooden mock-ups. They'd practice coordinating ram strikes. They'd practice the rush through a breach and the house-to-house fighting that followed. This professional training meant that when Assyrian soldiers actually faced a siege, they'd done it dozens of times already in training. Compare this to defenders, usually militia, often with little or no training. Maybe some had fought in previous skirmishes, but systematic siege defense training, almost never. The professionalism gap was enormous. The Assyrian Empire's fall in 612 BCE, when Nineveh itself was besieged and destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and others, is grimly ironic. The masters of siege warfare were themselves besieged. The coalition forces used Assyrian siege techniques against Assyrian fortifications. The siege of Nineveh lasted 3 months. The walls, some of the most formidable in the ancient world, eventually fell. The city was burned. The population slaughtered or scattered. The Assyrian Empire, which had terrorized the Near East for centuries, disappeared so completely that within a few generations people forgot it had existed. The ruins of its cities were covered by sand. Its language fell out of use. Its history was preserved only in the cities it had conquered, remembered as a byword for cruelty and terror. But the siege technology survived. The Babylonians inherited it. When Nebuchadnezzar III besieged Jerusalem in 586 BCE, 85 years after Sennacherib had accepted tribute and withdrawn, the Babylonian army used the same techniques. Siege towers, battering rams, ramps. Jerusalem's walls, which had escaped Assyrian siege towers, fell to their Babylonian descendants. The city was destroyed, the temple burned, the population deported to Babylon. The walls became death traps just as they had at Lachish. The Persian Empire, which conquered Babylon, inherited the siege technology. The Greeks encountered it and adapted it. Alexander the Great's sieges were marvels of engineering, but they built on foundations laid by Assyrian engineers 1,000 years earlier. The siege of Tyre in 332 BCE showed how far the technology had evolved. Tyre was built on an island, protected by the sea. Alexander couldn't use the standard approach, so he built a causeway, an artificial land bridge across 1/2 mile of open water. Then he brought siege towers across this causeway to the city walls. The siege towers used at Tyre were enormous, reportedly 150 feet tall, much larger than Assyrian towers. But the basic design was the same. Wooden frame on wheels, multiple levels, arches for suppression, battering ram inside, protective covering, water system for fire suppression. The conceptual lineage was direct. The Romans refined the technology further. Roman siege towers at the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE were even larger. But again, the fundamentals remained Assyrian. Build a ramp or approach route, bring a tower, match the height of enemy walls, use the ram to breach, storm through. The siege tower remained effective military technology for over 1,500 years after the Assyrians developed it. Only with the development of gunpowder artillery did fortification warfare fundamentally change. Cannon could breach walls more effectively than battering rams. Bombardment from a distance replaced approach and contact. But even then, the legacy persisted. Siege warfare remained an engineering problem requiring professional military engineers. The idea that fortifications could be systematically defeated through application of technology and resources, this remained constant from Assyrian times through World War II. The human cost of this technological evolution is almost impossible to calculate. How many cities fell to Assyrian siege towers? How many people died on walls that became death traps? How many families were torn apart by deportations? The Assyrian royal inscriptions boast about numbers, tens of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands deported, entire peoples erased from their homelands. These numbers might be exaggerated for propaganda, but even if they're inflated by half, we're talking about genocidal levels of violence, the systematic destruction of entire populations, the erasure of cultures, the extinction of languages, all made possible by siege towers and battering rams. This is the dark side of technological innovation. The Assyrian engineers who designed these machines were brilliant. The mathematics of ramp construction, The physics of battering rams, the structural engineering of towers, all impressive intellectual achievements. But these achievements served mass murder. We can't escape this paradox. We admire the engineering while recoiling from its purpose. The reliefs in the British Museum showing the siege of Lachish are beautiful artifacts. The craftsmanship is exquisite, the detail remarkable. They're historically invaluable, but they depict atrocities. Prisoners being flayed alive, cities being destroyed, populations being deported. The same mind that could appreciate the artistry of these reliefs planned the cruelties they depict. When we study Assyrian siege warfare, we're studying how humans became systematically efficient at killing other humans. The professionalization of violence, the industrialization of conquest, the bureaucratization of terror. These are not comfortable topics, but they're important, because the pattern repeated throughout history. Professional military engineering, systematic application of technology to warfare, coordination of resources to achieve military objectives. These Assyrian innovations became the template for all subsequent empire building. The Romans did it, the Mongols did it, modern militaries do it. The Assyrian legacy isn't just siege towers, it's the idea that warfare can be solved through organization, technology, and ruthless application of resources. When defenders at Lachish watched the Assyrian ramp rising, when they felt their walls shaking under the battering rams, when they realized their fortifications had become death traps, they were experiencing something that would be repeated thousands of times across human history. The moment when defensive measures became inadequate. When the technology of offense surpassed the technology of defense, when safety became illusion. This is the day the Assyrians used siege towers. This is why walls became death traps, not just at Lachish, not just in 701 BCE, but as a permanent transformation in military affairs, a transformation whose echoes continue today. We no longer build stone walls around cities, but we still build defensive systems, and we still discover that determined attackers with sufficient resources can breach any defense. The Assyrian siege engineers proved this truth 2,700 years ago. The lesson remains valid. No defense is impregnable. Given time, resources, and expertise, any fortification can be breached. The walls will fall, and those who trusted in walls for safety will discover they've become tombs instead. This was the Assyrian gift to military history. Not just the siege tower itself, but the knowledge that defensive thinking is ultimately futile against systematic offensive engineering. The only defense that works is to never face the siege, to surrender before the towers appear, to acknowledge superior force before it's demonstrated. This is what Sennacherib's siege of Lachish taught the ancient world. This is what the reliefs in his palace proclaimed. This is what King Hezekiah learned when he stripped the gold from Solomon's temple to pay tribute. Resistance is futile. The siege towers cannot be stopped. Your walls cannot protect you. Better to surrender now than face what comes when the walls fall.